There is a box in the corner of the room. It has been there for 3 years, maybe 4. You walk past it every morning. You never open it. You never move it. And somehow, you never throw it away. Inside, there might be an old cable for a phone you no longer own, a birthday card from someone you barely remember, a small object that no longer has a name in your life, only a feeling. Nothing in that box is useful. And yet it stays. Not because you forgot it was there, but because some quiet part of you decided without words that removing it would mean losing something you cannot quite name. So here's the question that matters. What are we really holding on to? The object or the person we were when it still meant something? Long before we had houses, we had shelters. Long before we had shelves, we had small piles of carefully chosen things. A sharpened stone, a piece of dried food, a fragment of bone that could still be useful. Our ancestors did not collect objects out of habit. They collected them out of necessity. In a world where resources were unpredictable, keeping things was the same as staying alive. This is where it begins, my friends. Not in our homes, but in our history. The human brain learned, over thousands of years, to treat physical objects as extensions of safety. When food was scarce, storing it meant surviving the winter. When tools were rare, holding on to a broken one meant you still had something to work with. The mind developed a simple but powerful rule. Do not discard what may still have value. And because the future was always uncertain, almost everything held potential value. Psychologists call part of this the endowment effect, the tendency to place higher value on things simply because we own them. Studies have shown that people often demand significantly more money to give up an object they possess than they would ever pay to acquire it in the first place. Ownership, it turns out, changes how the brain perceives worth. The moment something becomes ours, it becomes more valuable than it objectively is. But this was not a flaw in early human thinking. It was a feature. A mind that released resources too easily would not survive long in an environment where every tool, every scrap, every small advantage mattered. Holding on was rational. Letting go was risk. What this created, slowly and quietly, was a deep psychological pattern, a baseline assumption that keeping is better than releasing, that objects represent security, that an empty hand is more dangerous than a full one. Consider how this shows up even in small moments. A woman keeps a dress she's not worn in 6 years, not because she plans to wear it, but because the act of keeping it feels like preserving a possibility, the possibility of a different occasion, a different version of herself, a life that has not happened yet but might. The dress is not clothing anymore. It is a quiet promise to herself. This is not unusual behavior. It is ancient behavior wearing modern clothes. And here is what makes it so persistent. The brain does not naturally separate the emotional memory attached to an object from the object itself. When we look at that old dress, that broken watch, that box of cables, we do not simply see an item. We see a moment in time. We see a feeling. We see a version of ourselves that still exists, preserved inside that thing, waiting. The original instinct was survival. But survival has a long memory. And long after the danger passed, the pattern remained, quietly shaping how we fill our rooms, our shelves, our lives with things we no longer need but cannot bring ourselves to release. At some point in human history, something shifted. Objects stopped being only tools. They became something harder to define, carriers of time, proof of experience, quiet evidence that a moment once existed. A clay pot was no longer just a container. It was the hands that shaped it. A woven cloth was no longer just fabric. It was the winter it kept someone warm. The object and the memory fused together, and separating them began to feel like a small kind of loss. This was not a sudden change. It happened slowly, the way most deep changes do, through repetition, through emotion, through the gradual layering of meaning onto material things. Anthropologists have found evidence of this across nearly every human culture. Ancient burial sites, thousands of years old, contain objects placed beside the dead, tools, ornaments, personal items, suggesting that even early humans understood objects as extensions of a person's identity, not just useful things, but meaningful things, things that carried something of the self inside them. This tells us something important. The emotional relationship between humans and objects is not a modern weakness. It is an ancient language, one that the mind has always used to hold on to what it cannot keep, any other way. And so, a system formed. Not a system we designed, but one that developed naturally through lived experience. When a person goes through something significant, a loss, a transformation, a period of intense feeling, the objects present during that time become anchored to it. The brain, which is always looking for ways to store and retrieve emotional information, uses physical things as markers. Touch the object, return to the feeling. See it on the shelf, remember who you were. Psychologists refer to this as object attachment, a process where possessions become emotionally significant not for what they do, but for what they represent. Research suggests that this kind of attachment forms most strongly during periods of personal change or emotional intensity, which is why objects from childhood, from relationships, or from difficult times tend to be the hardest to release. A man keeps his father's old wristwatch, even though it stopped working years ago. He never wears it. He rarely looks at it, but it sits in his drawer, and somewhere in his mind its presence is a form of continuity, a thread connecting him to a person and a time that no longer exists in any other form. Throwing it away would not just mean losing an object. It would feel like losing the last physical proof that something real once happened. This is how clutter quietly begins. Not with laziness, not with disorder, but with meaning, genuine, human meaning, attached to objects one by one, until a room is no longer just a space, but a landscape of accumulated memory. The original shift from tool to symbol was natural and even beautiful. But what happens when the symbols multiply? When every corner holds a memory, every drawer holds a version of the past, that is where the weight begins to show. There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. You feel it on a Sunday afternoon, standing in a room full of things, looking around and noticing, without quite knowing why, that something feels heavy. Not the objects themselves, something beneath them, something the objects are quietly doing to you without your permission. This is the hidden cost of clutter, and it rarely announces itself clearly. The mind, as it turns out, does not simply ignore the things around it. Every object in a space makes a small silent demand on attention, not loudly, not urgently, but persistently. Researchers studying cognitive load have found that cluttered environments consistently increase levels of cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, particularly in people who spend extended time in them. The visual noise of accumulated objects keeps the brain in a low-level state of processing, a background hum of unresolved decisions and unfinished business. In simple terms, a cluttered room is a room full of things your mind never fully stopped thinking about. But the deeper cost is not neurological. It is emotional. Because most clutter is not random accumulation. It is, as we have seen, a collection of meaningful objects, memories, identities, promises to a former self. And this is precisely what makes it so quietly exhausting. Every time you see that unworn dress, some part of your mind revisits the story attached to it. Every time you open that drawer and find the broken watch, you briefly return to the relationship, the loss, the version of yourself that belonged to that time. You are not just living in your present space. You are simultaneously inhabiting every moment those objects represent. And that is an enormous amount of internal weight to carry without ever naming it. A woman in her late 30s once described her apartment as feeling like a museum of her own life. Every room containing artifacts from a different chapter. Old textbooks from a degree she never used, letters from a relationship that ended badly, clothes from a body she no longer had. She was not disorganized. She was, in her own words, afraid that if she removed the evidence, the experiences would stop being real. This is the paradox at the heart of clutter. We keep objects to protect ourselves from loss, but in doing so, we prevent ourselves from fully moving forward. The very things meant to preserve the past and upholding the present still. And the mind, caught between two times, grows quietly exhausted. There is also something else happening, something harder to see. When we surround ourselves with objects from who we were, we subtly reinforce those older identities. The room becomes a mirror reflecting not who we are, but who we used to be, and every morning we wake up inside that reflection, shaped by it before the day has even begun. The objects do not trap us violently. They do it gently, slowly, with all the warmth of something we once loved, and that is what makes them so difficult to question. For most of human history, accumulation had natural limits. Objects were difficult to make, expensive to buy, and hard to transport. A household contained what it needed, and little more, not out of wisdom, but out of simple constraint. The question was never, should I keep this? It was, can I afford to replace it if I let it go? Scarcity made the decision for people, long before psychology ever had to. Then, gradually, that changed. The rise of industrial manufacturing in the 19th century made objects cheaper and more available than ever before. By the mid-20th century, mass production had transformed consumption from necessity into habit. Stores filled, catalogs thickened, homes expanded. Not because families grew larger, but because they needed more space for more things. In the United States, the average home size more than doubled between the 1950s and the 2000s, and yet surveys consistently show that people still feel they do not have enough storage space. The objects multiplied, but the psychological patterns beneath them remained the same. What changed was the context. The ancient instinct to keep and preserve, the one built for genuine scarcity, was now operating inside a world of extraordinary abundance. The brain still whispered, this might be useful, this might have value. Do not let it go. But now, instead of applying that instinct to a single sharpened stone or a piece of dried food, it applied it to everything, to promotional gifts, to packaging, to objects bought impulsively and used once and placed on a shelf to quietly wait for a purpose that never came. Consumer culture did not create the psychology of clutter, but it fed it, consistently, systematically, and with great commercial interest. Marketing learned early that the feeling of acquisition, the moment of purchase, produces a brief but real sense of emotional satisfaction. Buying something new feels like solving a problem, even when no problem existed. And so the cycle deepened. Accumulate, feel temporarily satisfied, feel the weight of accumulation. Seek relief through more acquisition. A man buys an organizer to manage the clutter in his home office. The organizer itself becomes part of the clutter within 6 months. This is not a personal failure. It is a pattern so common it has become almost invisible, the attempt to solve accumulation with more objects, because the culture surrounding us frames every problem as something that can be purchased away. What this created over generations was a collective normalization. Clutter stopped being seen as a sign of something worth examining. It became simply the default condition of a modern home, unremarkable, expected, quietly accepted. People stopped asking why their spaces felt heavy, because everyone's spaces felt heavy, and shared discomfort rarely gets questioned. The personal became universal. The ancient instinct met the modern system, and together, they built rooms that look nothing like shelters, but feel, in some tired and unspoken way, exactly like them. We have spent a long time in this video looking at why we hold on, but perhaps the more important question is not why. We understand that now. The more important question is, what does it actually mean to let go? Because letting go of a cluttered room is rarely just a physical act. Anyone who has ever tried to declutter seriously, not just tidied, but genuinely removed things that mattered, knows that it does not feel like cleaning. It feels like a series of small decisions about identity, about which version of yourself you are still carrying and which ones you are finally willing to release. That unworn dress is not just fabric. It is a self you once imagined becoming. Releasing it means acknowledging, quietly and without drama, that this particular future is no longer the one you are living toward. That is not a trivial moment. It asks something real of you. And this is why advice like, if you haven't used it in a year, throw it away, so often fails to hold. It treats the object as the problem, when the object is only the surface. Beneath it is a question the mind has been quietly avoiding. Who am I now, compared to who I was when this still meant something? Letting go, in its deepest sense, is an act of self-definition. It is choosing, deliberately and gently, which parts of your past you carry forward. Not because forgetting is the goal, but because not everything needs a physical anchor to remain real. A memory does not disappear when its object does. A relationship does not become less true because the letters are gone. A version of yourself does not stop having existed simply because you stopped preserving its evidence. The Japanese concept of mono no aware, a phrase that loosely means the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, suggests that beauty and meaning are not diminished by transience. They are, in some ways, deepened by it. The cherry blossom is not less beautiful because it falls. The moment is not less real because it passed. Perhaps our objects deserve the same understanding. They were meaningful. They served their purpose. Emotional, practical, symbolic, and releasing them when the time comes is not a betrayal of the past. It is a form of respect for it, an acknowledgement that it happened, that it mattered, and that you are now someone who has moved through it. A lighter room, then, is not simply a tidier space. It is a space that reflects who you actually are. Not a museum of every version you have ever been, but a living place shaped by your present self. This does not mean releasing everything. It means becoming honest about what you are keeping and why. It means asking gently whether the weight you carry is still serving you, or whether you have simply grown so used to carrying it that you forgot it was ever a choice. The objects will wait quietly for your answer. They always do. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.